This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. Brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a senior lecturer in Middle Eastern and African history at Tel Aviv University and author of a new book entitled Reading Clocks Alla Turca, Time and Society in the Late Ottoman Empire, that was recently published by the University of Chicago Press, and it explores the introduction of concepts of time into the Ottoman society and government in the latest chapters of the empire that ruled much of the Middle East in the 19th and early 20th century. Dr. Avner Wishnitzer, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get to the Ottoman case, let's talk about time standardization in general. The transition of the concept of time from a social one to a physical one, is it really inextricably linked to modernity?
Well, there are great debates about the transformation in modes of time organization and concepts of time. Whether this transformation begins very late only with industrial capitalism, or does it begin really much earlier in the late Middle Ages with urbanization and the growing of commerce and things like that. In the non-European world, which is where I'm located, these debates are somewhat more remote from what you actually see on the ground. It used to be that scholars would link the introduction of new understandings of time, and this is important. It's not that we're talking about the introduction of a concept of time. There was always some concepts of time.
No, but it's the fact that it's quantifiable, it's linear, all those things.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to understand whether it's really a Western modern concept per se, or is it more complicated than
It's definitely more complicated than that, because I would say that the very transition into such a quantifiable, linear entity is linked also to the colonial encounter. So it's not exclusively, but it's also the fact that Europeans encounter different societies with different understandings of time, and it is also through that encounter that they develop a more coherent sense of their own time, which they contrast with all these other temporalities. It's interesting to know that the opposite happens in some of these colonial societies. For example, my colleague On Barak has shown how in Egypt, from a certain point on, Egyptians themselves embrace a notion of Egyptian time to counter British colonial constructs.
What does it mean, Egyptian time?
It means a delayed time. It means a time that is not inhumanely accurate. It is our time as opposed to the colonial officials' time, which is inhumane, which is machine-like.
Yeah.
So you see these kind of constructions also in the Ottoman Empire, but to a lesser extent.
But the colonial powers really associated this lack of physical time, of punctuality, with the backwardness of non-European societies. So, the concept of Egyptian time is very interesting in this sense, because it is, in a sense, some sort of rebellion that also has political undertones to it. In the Ottoman case, before we delve into it in more detail, what was really the political subtext of the introduction of time? Because on the one hand, they were non-European and were proud of it. On the other hand, they had to run an empire with a huge state apparatus that had to be coordinated. And one way to coordinate those things is by standardizing the concept of time. Tell us a bit about that.
Exactly. So if you compare the Ottoman with the Egyptian case, you see that what happens in the Ottoman Empire is that an indigenous elite is promoting what amounts to a far-reaching transformation in what I call temporal culture. But it is not colonial rule that drives this process forward. And at the same time, this elite is identified, sometimes self-identified, sometimes identified by other groups with foreigners. So there is a notion here of semi-colonialism. Who are they serving? These people who are forcing upon us, the people, the lower-ranking clerks, students, soldiers. Who are they serving? elite.
The Ottoman, the indigenous elite.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So the Ottoman Empire in the second half of the 19th century is in a semi-colonial position. So
how so?
Because they are dependent in many ways, economically, politically, militarily, on European powers, to the extent that by the last quarter of the century, more or less, a significant part of the Ottoman economy is run by European powers, basically, because of the external debt of the Ottoman Empire. So you cannot think about new concepts of time and new modes of organizing time without thinking about Europe. And when thinking about Europe and us, the Ottomans, you cannot avoid questions of self-identity, of who we are not, who do we want to be, and how do we see our future. What are we? Are we part of this civilization that is determined in Europe? Do we want to be part of it? To what extent? What remains ours? So all these questions kind of come together when talking about time.
And what are the different answers to those questions, and how are they distributed in the Ottoman debate at the time? Are there more people who are pro-Westernization, as it were, more people of inward-looking in the sense?
So let me start by saying a few words on how this process that I'm trying to describe begins. It begins much earlier. Earlier, I mean, before the second half of the 19th century. I start to see this change in the late 18th century, which is a time that the Ottoman elite realize that a significant change must take place, at least within the state apparatus.
Right.
Now, when I say elite, I really mean the palace elite, the people around the sultans who are seeking centralization and later rationalization of the state apparatus. And
but is it a normative choice, or is it just
it is not a normative choice, and that's the point. It's not. It is a very practical issue. So high officials in the offices of the Grand Vizier are looking for solutions to cope with rising amount of paperwork they have to deal with. So they have to discipline the clerks and set a schedule for the workday. For example, later on, the military, they have to adopt new tactics, and these tactics rely on strict discipline. So they have to come up with new ways of organizing the time of the soldiers, and so on and so forth. Practical problems that need answers. What happens in the second half of the 19th century, that these practical solutions that have to do with time, for example, how to organize a school, become associated in the minds of the middle and upper classes with a broader notion of progress. So it is by saving time, being more punctual, more efficient, more productive, that we can close the gap that had opened between us and the Europeans. So this notion of progress, this imagining of the power relations in the world in terms of temporal distance, right? So the more powerful advanced, Okay, it's an idea we've become so accustomed to that it's hard for us to imagine the world without it. But it's ultimately just an idea, a
but
concept.
that sounds to me like a complete submission to Western notions of time.
Okay,
so what was the counter reaction to that?
So I would say that in the Tanzimat period, roughly between the late 1830s and the 1870s, the elite adopts this notion of progress, material progress, and associates this material progress with a sense of civilizational superiority.
Right.
We want to be part of that. And they lead the empire well into the 70s, basically. But there is opposition to this trend.
Wait, what happened in the 70s?
In the 70s, there's a change of power, basically, and the real power goes back to the palace. From the bureaucratic elite that had led the empire for a few decades. And then it's Sultan Abdulhamid II from 1876 until 1908 who rules, and he's the main person in the Ottoman system. And he already reflects a very different perspective. And this perspective is more concerned about delineating a distinct Ottomanness.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to be part of this civilization. This is the words they're using, right? They're using the words like progress and civilization. And we want to be part of that, but to maintain our own character and traditions. And so, for example, yes, we have to be more punctual. We have to be more productive. And we have to teach people about the value of time, which is a term that keeps on coming in contemporary press, in textbooks for schools.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mean the masses, so that every walk of life would be right.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
We have to teach the value of time to the people.
Right.
You can also think about the clock towers in the latter part of the Hamidian period as partly an ideological project aimed to educate the masses about the importance of time, the value of time. It keeps on coming. And time is money. Vakitna kitir. It's an expression you will find very often.
It wasn't invented in America.
It was. They actually associate it with the English, usually.
Right, okay.
The English are the most punctual people, most productive, and if you think about the current politics and with Britain being the greatest empire, it's quite obvious why they would make this connection. Contemporary writers and intellectuals. So they want to instill these notions. For example, they rely on the Ottoman hour system, right, rather than adopt the European meantime system.
Right. And how was it different? The Ottoman
the
hour
Ottoman
system,
hour system was, by that time, for at least in the bigger cities, it was 2 rounds of clock hours counted from sunset to sunset the following day. So each evening at sunset, when you hear the evening azan, the call for prayer, you would set your clocks to show 12.
Right.
So it's you constantly have to set the clock, but it is coherent with other cycles.
Right.
And for people at that time, it was intuitive.
Yeah, but was it also a 24-hour system divided into minutes?
Double, 2 sets of 12 hours.
So the only change was when is midnight, as it were, when it
midnight
starts.
And midday, and when it starts. Yeah, but the important point is that sunset was the beginning of a new cycle of worship, a new day, calendarly speaking, like the calendar, just like in Judaism. The day changes at sunset. And then, a new cycle of hours. It made sense to people, right? And it was in coherence with the daily cycle of prayer. So when people began to learn about the European system, it was very alien to them. They couldn't understand the logic. And indeed, there is no logic in the sense of relation to natural rhythms and so forth. So they actually had to be taught how to do it, but that happened later. For most people, the European system remained something very strange, something they did not use, and that even within the state apparatus was only used by specific organs like the foreign ministry and later on the military also.
My next question is perhaps slightly beyond the scope of your book, but it's about how the concept of time changed during and after the Kemalist Revolution, where Turkey was taken into or forced into a modern period where it was supposed to become a full-fledged modern state. So was it accompanied by, again, a full submission to the Western concept of time? Did the Kemalist, did Ataturk himself and his associates, did they address the question of time at all?
Oh, certainly. But I would say that, to me, the most interesting thing is that whereas you see the adoption of first, as I said, practical measures that have to do with the organization of daily routines in different systems, state apparatus, transportation systems, and so on and so forth. This begins much earlier, and then these are being associated with larger concepts of historical time. And then, as I said, in order to traverse this temporal distance more quickly, we have to save time on our daily basis, on our daily work, to be more efficient. So this happens already. These notions become widespread, at least within the middle and upper classes, already in the late 19th century. But what happens with the Kemalist Revolution is that they try very consciously to create a rupture between the Ottoman past and the Republican present. And this rupture is created in many ways. One of them is the change, the final death blow to the Ottoman hour system, which is abolished by law in early 1926. And we have to see it as part of all these measures against, the Arabic alphabet and dress code, new dress codes, and that are designed to distance the move of the capital from Istanbul to Ankara, to create the distance between the Ottoman past. So this is a new era, right? So in terms of historical time, this is a new era. Now we are modern. Before that, we were never fully modern. So,
which is true in a sense, isn't it? I mean,
it depends
yes and no.
It depends what you mean by being modern. That's a whole different question.
But there was an ongoing ambivalence in the late Ottoman Empire.
What the late Ottoman, more conservative modernists would say, that being modern does not mean being European. Yeah. And in this, they shared with many other people in Asia and Africa and South America and so on. For them, the Kemalist rupture was capitulation.
Because the Kemalists did associate modernity with Europeans.
Exactly. Many of the late Ottoman thinkers and certainly people in the Committee of Union and Progress certainly associated modernity with Europe, or saw Europe as their epitome of modernity. But at the same time, I'm thinking of people like Namik Kemal, right? At the same time, they preached holding on to some of, quote unquote, our values, which of course is discursively created. It's not something that it simply lies there. But I think it's interesting to see that in many ways the Kemalist Revolution effectively erased the traces that leaded history back into Ottoman times. Right. So they say, no, we brought modern time. Now we are living in a different era with a new system of time. But actually, it began much earlier. Right.
Okay. Dr. Avner Wishnitzer, I'm afraid this is all we have time for. But thank you very much for coming in today. You're a senior lecturer in Middle Eastern and African history at Tel Aviv University and the author of the recently published Reading Clocks Alla Turca, Time and Society in the Late Ottoman Empire. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
בכל מקום, בכל כאב, יש לך פינה בלב, מיוחדת או שמחה. הדלת נשארה פתוחה, אל תבנה אצלי אמון. העולם שינה כיוון, החלום שלי נשרף, אני חוזרת למרדף,